Don't know what's going on. Apologize for that, you all. Is that on my end? Don't know what's going on. I know what it is. Apologize for that.
The window up.
See, rookie mistake.
Oh, it's not just rookies that make that mistake.
All right. So I think we're good to go now. And what's up, BK, MJ?
Hey, BK, let me know if you got the hats that I was very tempted to keep, but sent anyway. I got Mr. Phil Fox sent me some shirts and a book, and I guess somehow hats that were intended for BK ended up in my kit too. They were really nice hats. So,
oh yeah.
Yeah, he's like, I asked him about it because it was a little too big for my head, but he said they weren't supposed to be for me. So that's all I went ahead and shipped them off for. But they were nice. I got to tell you, I was tempted there for a minute, but Holy Spirit said no, they're not for you.
Hey, that just means you're still in the club. You're still in the family.
That's right.
All right. So as y'all come in, thank you for joining us tonight. This is going to be a much less controversial discussion than.
Oh no, it's not. No, it's not. It gets hairy, man.
That's true. I guess I shouldn't speak too soon.
Yeah.
But it's gonna be good. Hopefully, this is gonna be. I think I'm ready to learn some stuff tonight too, because this is more of a nuanced topic for most people, unless you really study it or teach it on a day-to-day basis. With that being said, well, actually, let me say this. For those who are joining, make sure you subscribe. Make sure you hit the bell. Our goal here is to help everybody enter into a confirmed, confident, and eternal relationship with the source of all life and purpose.
Amen.
With that being said, Johnathan, thank you for joining me. Could you yes, sir. Could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, and we'll go from there.
Well, I am the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professor at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, which you can find at trinitysem.edu. One of my favorite students ever is in the chat tonight, MJ Jackson.
MJ.
Yeah. And he goes there. I think Mr. Phil Fox is going to be coming on board soon. So we are the seminary for nerds. No, the seminary seems to be attracting some of the best and brightest out there in the YouTube world. So we're particularly proud of that. I also co-host the Trinity Radio podcast here on YouTube, which you can find at youtube.com/Braxton Hunter, who is the president of Trinity and my co-host there. And then we also have the Trinity Radio Extra channel on YouTube. The Trinity Radio main is mostly apologetic issues addressing atheists. And then Trinity Radio Extra gets into more theological issues. And then we finally have, or at least I have, a website that I need to do a lot more with, which is called, or a YouTube channel called Theology Geek Fitness, where I'm trying to encourage theology people interested laypersons, certainly other academics, my own co-host, to get more physically active and exercise. So
shots fired.
Yeah. Oh, I do it live on the broadcast too. But I started that because a couple of years ago, I packed on significant weight and was having health issues and heart issues and things like that. And so it was, you need to do something about this. And I did. And I realized, well, there's probably a lot of other people that need to do something too. So trying to be encouraging and motivating. I was inspired by people like Chris Featherstone, who's he's a personal trainer, also a professor at Trinity, Tim Stratton, and some of these other guys that are in really good shape. I was like, you know what? I need to get in shape. So I did that and started the Theology Geek Fitness. And we have a Facebook group where we're all encouraging and motivating one another. So
no, that's pretty cool. I'm trying to get back Myself, I tore my tendon here. First day back in the gym. Everything shut down with my friend who is really into working out, and then surgery and rehab and everything. So I'm just at the point where I can go back to the gym now. I've been there for the last couple of weeks, so
yeah,
I'll get back.
Yeah, it takes me, and don't push it, man. Don't push it, or you just end up tearing something.
I know, that's what happened.
That's what, people laugh at me, but that's one of the, when COVID hit, I got out of the gym and started using those loop resistance bands and some other stuff. And people are like, you need to go lift for real weights. But I have not had a single injury since I started using them. And I get just as good of a workout. And I always, speaking of fire shots, I say, when you're as in good shape as me, then we'll talk about me going up the weights. But, you're not quite there yet. So, No, I promote that kind of training in calisthenics and stuff because it's just safer. But not for young folks like you. For old people like me, it's really healthy.
I ain't that young anymore now.
Well, you look a lot younger than me, so everyone's young to me. So
I hear you. Well, so I've seen a lot of things that you were posting or things that you do, and I reached out and we've talked, and it was a great conversation. And it was very nuanced in the way that you were explaining kind of some of the things that you study and teach.
Yeah.
And so I was like, it's a good discussion. As you said, everyone may not agree totally 100% in one direction or the other, but let's see what the facts are and where we can find agreement. And so, just to kind of start the conversation off, we're talking about finding meaning in the text, and also how did the New Testament writers themselves interpret or understand the scriptures of their day, which is the Old Testament, and how did they exegete, and what were their hermeneutic principles that first we have to understand before we can do our own principles, or before we can enact our own. So what's the relationship between the intended meaning of an Old Testament passage and the meaning ascribed or intended when a New Testament author cites or echoes or alludes to it?
Yeah. So when we talk about citations, echoes, and allusions, a citation will be pretty much a direct quote, and sometimes you'll see it introduced with a formula like "as it is written," and then they'll cite a verse. So that would be a citation. And an informal citation wouldn't have that, but its wording is either identical or close enough to tell that it's a passage from the Old Testament. Sometimes they get a little creative with that. Then you've got just echoes and allusions that either mention or thematically related to something that you find in the Old Testament. So it's not like an explicit or even implicit citation, but it is a callback. So if you will, to something. So what are they doing with those? And the intended meaning of the Old Testament and the intended meaning of the New Testament author calling back to those Old Testament passages. That's really the heart of the debate here. Now, all of this New Testament use of the Old Testament is a subcategory of what we call intertextuality. So,
can you explain what that is, just for?
Yes. So, people have often heard that probably I would say 33% a good ballpark figure of the Old Testament of the New Testament is Old Testament citations, echoes, and allusions, right? Roughly 33% of it. So a lot of people will say, well, it's almost a running commentary on the Old Testament in a sense. But intertextuality deals with more than just that, because, for example, people are familiar with in Jude and 2 Peter that certain intertestamental texts, the Assumption of Moses, for example, or Enoch, these things are referenced. These things are referenced in. So that's the non-canonical Jewish literature. Beyond that, people are familiar with Paul and Titus, or in Acts 17 at the Areopagus, quoting pagan poets, philosophers, writers, things like that. So those are the ones that people are familiar with. It goes deeper than that. You can look at Philippians chapter 1, where Paul says to live is for Christ and to die is to gain. Well, that last part of that, to die is gain, is just straight out of Plato's Apology, where Socrates says that same phrase, right? So you've got all of these intertextual cues in a text. So in intertextuality, you're looking beyond just, thank you, Michelle. You're looking beyond just Old Testament, but you're seeing what else is at play in there. And of course, the ancient Mediterranean world of the first century is an oral culture. So you're going to see a lot of these texts are going to be embedded just from common rhetoric sources, right? But there's a whole discipline dedicated to how do you know if something is a direct line of citation of an idea or a text from one previous thing to that. So Plato, some 400 years prior to Paul, was that something that Paul directly lifted from Plato, or is that something that was common in the air? After 400 years of Hellenism, that he pulled that from somewhere, but not necessarily intending to cite Plato.
So more like, was it just colloquial, and then he just kind of used it because it was just around,
right? Or is it an intentional reframing of something that, yes, I like this idea, gotcha, but I'm gonna put it in its proper understanding that it's centered on Christ, and that's why to live is Christ and die is gain, because you're gonna, and he talks about departing and be with Christ is so much better and all that, and of course Socrates is always going through things. Now there's like an intentional thing, in my opinion, about that, but some people would argue, no, that's probably just some sort of thing that became common phrasing or whatever, because Paul's really good at letting us know things, but I don't think that just because he says something one way means that it always works that way. So let me give you an example back to the Old Testament. So in Galatians 4, for example, one of the Second Temple methods of exegeting texts was allegory. And so you can find that even in Philo and other non-Christian literature of Hellenized Jews writing, But Paul explicitly says in Galatians 4 that when he's using Sarah and Hagar, he says he is doing allegory. He explicitly says so. So that gives us an idea that, no, he's not just totally butchering and over-spiritualizing. He's not pulling like an St. Augustine with parables here, he's not just pulling stuff out of meaning from that text. He lets us know this is what he's doing. So because he does something like that, or because he says something like, as your own poets have said, and then he gives a citation, that he's giving us a direct understanding within the text, or what he's doing with these passages, whether it's from the Old Testament or if it's from a pagan poet. Right. Same thing with Titus 2. But then you get some sticky situations like 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 4, where he's talking about the wilderness generation, and they drank from the same spiritual rock, and that rock was Christ. He never says, I'm making an allegory here. He's referring back to that rock, and he's making a typological statement that's Jesus, right? And there's some sense in which Paul said it's in the Bible. As Bible-believing Christians, we believe that. And so this gets into the question. These are just examples that help. I know it's a long way around.
No, it's good.
Point. But so when you say the intended meaning of the Old Testament and the intended meaning of the New Testament, two good ways to frame this up. There's others, and these are all nuanced, but two good ways is. You have some people that say what it meant in the Old Testament is exactly what it meant in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's a single meaning and a single thing to which that meaning is referring to, and whatever it meant in the Old Testament is what it means in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. And if we're unclear what it means in the Old Testament, and the New Testament author tells us it means this, that's it. Okay, right. Another way of looking at it is understanding that, and the people who who hold to that it's the same meaning in both testaments. They're going to argue that things that we're going to talk about in a minute, like sensus plenior, utterly bogus. They're going to also argue that the rules of Hillel, allegory, unless explicitly stated like Paul, or Pesher interpretation. So a lot of these, well, they'll allow for some Pesher, but a lot of these Second Temple hermeneutic methods that were common in that day for Jews interpreting texts, they're going to say no to all that, except for literal and maybe a little bit of allowances for a Pesher. Like a Pesher is saying that what that text is about is this right here. Like, so in Acts chapter 2, when Peter points back to Joel and says that about the sons and daughters of prophet, that's what's happening right here today. So they might allow for something like that if it's explicit in the text, or Paul's explicitly saying he's doing allegory. But other than that, it's literal all the way through. If it meant it in the Old Testament, it's what it means in the New. If the New Testament says something, that's what it originally meant in the Old. Okay, but other people are going to say that doesn't work, and I'm in this camp that doesn't really work.
So somebody was just asking, which way are you? So that,
yeah,
there we go.
I'm not in that camp. I'm sympathetic to it, and I'm going to try to explain why. But I just don't think it ultimately holds up text by text by text by text. So to give a common example, Matthew's use of Isaiah 7:14, right? That's about the virgin birth. Mm-hmm. Matthew applies that to Jesus. Okay. Now, there's a lot of debates about Amma in Hebrew and Parthenos in Greek about the word virgin that's translated there. The Hebrew could mean just any young woman, whereas the Greek is pretty solid. Some people will try to argue no, but that's clearly how Luke or Matthew thinks of it, right? And Luke typically is clearly thinking of Mary as a virgin too, but Matthew explicitly uses the Septuagint there, which uses Parthenos, which clearly means virgin. But if you take the single meaning in both things, and that means that you have to assume that Isaiah was talking about Jesus, even though it seems to be talking about a sign for specifically Ahaz, and so, and is that some sort of double fulfillment, or initial fulfillment, double fulfillment kind of thing? And the people on my side that say, well, the meaning is generally the same, but it appears in different contexts and can refer to different things, right? So the meaning of it in Isaiah probably was something, some people theorize it was Isaiah's son next chapter. Some people say it was Hezekiah maybe, or all kinds of theories about what it was, but it did have a meaning for its day, as well as a fuller meaning that Matthew picked up on to see in that verse. Yeah. And that gets into, double fulfillment in a way that you could say that was a legitimate use of that, even though Matthew would discount the original meaning that might have been a temporary fulfillment, because what they're after is patterns of fulfillment as God works through history. So if it has its fuller fulfillment in Christ, it's okay that there was some other referent. Whereas if you don't hold to that view, you have to say that Isaiah was talking about Jesus. And so now what that does is, while I understand you want to preserve the Old Testament's text and meaning, and that's what it means in both Testaments, what you've done is, if you've let the New Testament dictate what the Old Testament meant, which is the exact opposite of what you wanted to accomplish by saying it means the same thing in both Testaments. So now you're saying that no matter what Isaiah was on about in chapters 7, 8, and 9, this little verse in the middle of it's about Jesus no matter what, because we have that in the New Testament. And that it doesn't, so that doesn't always work. And that does violence to what it meant to the original author. So a lot of the people that argue for the single meaning in both Testaments, they want to say that the Old Testament needs to control the meaning, and whatever it meant is in the New Testament, and only when the New Testament gives us information can we then understand the Old Testament, if we can't do the Old Testament on its own.
Right.
And so that doesn't always work from text to text.
So you essentially cut your own feet out from under you.
Right. And you backfire on what you want to do, because what you're wanting to do, for the most part, these people are arguing the Old Testament texts mean what they mean to their original audience, because there's a dictum in hermeneutics that you mentioned in our passage. Douglas Stewart and Gordon Fee talk about this in their How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. A text can't mean what it never meant.
Yeah.
Right.
This will be my next thing.
Right. A text can't mean what it never meant. Now, that's a hermeneutic principle that we apply for things like taking a text and trying to argue for a specific application, or maybe a theological position or whatever. But if the text never meant that, then it can't mean that now. Right.
So let me ask, not to cut you off. So I don't know where I had that question, but we'll come back to the sensus plenior.
Yeah, we'll tackle that in a minute, but this is kind of relevant to the framework. Yeah.
So yeah, I have, and actually I'm going to get some shirts made eventually, but last year it kind of almost became like a tagline, because I kept saying it, and I got really kind of big into teaching hermeneutics, because there was so much, maybe just because I was in the house more, I was seeing and hearing so much more stuff online. And so I even created a course for the Bible app. I'm working on creating an actual course that people can take. And so, like, what I mean, just for clarification for everyone else, is when we can't uncover a meaning in the text today that would have been foreign, theologically or logically foreign, to the original audience. And so when I say it, I don't mean it in the nuance of what you were describing, of how this text could be seen or could be prophetic in a double way. Yeah. I'm more going at the people who are, and we're both on the same page on what I'm about to say here, I think. Romans 8:32, it says, he who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? And so somebody might read it and say, well, that's telling me that God's going to give me whatever I want, right?
Yeah, whatever you ask in my name, I shall be given, right?
Exactly. And
where's my Mercedes? Yeah.
Exactly. And so when I say that text can never mean what it never meant, anybody reading that letter that Paul wrote to Rome or to the Roman churches, they would not assume, oh, that means, health and wealth. That would not be their natural inclination. Right. And so as you're explaining the nuance and how, even New Testament writers use Old Testament passages to communicate a truth. And when they did, it wasn't eisegesis. And I guess maybe some in that first kind of group might say that it is. I'm not sure. What would you say as far as that?
Well, that's what they would accuse the New Testament authors of doing if they granted that they were using Second Temple hermeneutics. But see, my response to that is, if that's what was okay and permissible at the time,
right, then
your charge of eisegesis that you would give to somebody who's just butchering a text won't stick to the New Testament authors who were inspired, right? So, God was working within their structures at the time, and the way, not just their personalities and stuff, but their ways of thinking about things. And granted, a lot of these things you don't find that you find in other Second Temple literature, but you do find some of these. So you can find when Jesus is answering Satan and when he's being tempted, and in Luke, the parallel, when he's quoting Deuteronomy there, he's taking a literalist approach to that.
Right.
Man shall not live on bread alone, but every word from God. So he's being very literal. So that's there. You have things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have all of this other phenomena that just doesn't seem that seems more comfortable with them using a variety of Second Temple ways of doing exegesis. A really good primer book for this, and it catalogs almost. There's a very expensive New Testament use of the Old Testament commentary by G.K. Bills, the editor. It's big and it's heavy and it's expensive, but it's worth owning. But just something that gives you a brief overview of everything and still catalogs a whole bunch of the echoes, citations, and allusions is this book, Biblical Exegesis in the Apostolic Period, Richard Longenecker's book. That there's a lot of books. Richard Hayes' books on echoes of Scripture in the letters of Paul is a popular one, and he also has in the Gospels as well. The Right Doctrine from the Wrong Texts is another popular one. There's a lot of books on New Testament use of the Old Testament. There's a Three Views book that's fantastic, but this is the one that I think everyone should start with, Biblical Exegesis of the Apostolic Period, because it gives you a good, solid, but not overly technical and not long-winded explanation of where the debate is, what's going on, what they were doing in the first century Jewish ways of thinking about hermeneutics, and then it catalogs them by what Jesus, what the gospel writers did, and then Paul and the epistle authors and their uses of the Old Testament.
That's good.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is a follow-up question. So we, in our current context, and really, I guess everything is contemporary when you're alive. So the way we talk and write, this makes sense. Like the view that you take as far as what the New Testament writers did, and even what we do, it makes sense just based on how we talk. Or right, we say stuff where the person, like if I'm talking to you, usually intuitively, if I'm being allegorical, even if I don't say it, right, here comes the allegory. And you also know when I'm at least attempting to quote something directly. And so why would we assume that the New Testament writers didn't have that same capacity and that the original audience didn't have the same capacity to recognize it? Yeah.
We shouldn't, but there are people, and you'll find this has implications for your theology. So for eschatology, even if you look at like really dense passages with Old Testament citations, you look at Romans 9, that can have an impact on your soteriology, how you understand New Testament use of the Old Testament. How much of the broader context do the New Testament authors bring in when they're just even echoing or just doing a call, not even a citation, much less an outright citation? How much of that broader context are they bringing into it? And people disagree on that as well. So there's a lot of things that hang on your understanding of the New Testament use of the Old Testament. I would also argue that if you have certain views of this, certain theological viewpoints I've noticed that advocates have for one side or the other are inconsistent with theological views that they hold because of what they'll argue for the how the Old Testament text is being used versus what they think theologically in general. And you're like, well, if you get that from this text and this passage, and you've got your proof text for your particular view of eschatology or soteriology or whatever. But I also heard you say that this is how you think you understand the New Testament use of the Old Testament, but that wouldn't work for the way that this proof text serves your particular theological framework. So, that's why I'm glad that you're teaching hermeneutics, because your hermeneutics, that's going to dictate a lot of where you land theologically on various issues, right? Yeah. And people don't discuss that. People usually, before they learn hermeneutics, before they learn, and this is a subcategory, intertextuality is a subcategory of hermeneutics, and then New Testament use of the Old Testament is a subcategory of intertextuality. So we're talking about two things removed from the broader. This is a hermeneutics issue, it was true. But even before they bother with basic hermeneutics, they've been given a tradition or a systematic theology text that's what they go to first, and that's actually their first hermeneutics class. Right. Yeah. And that's, I think, a train wreck for a lot of it. But
with that kind of even if it's not a systematic theology, the presuppositional bias that whatever anyone wants to say, if you're Reformed or Calvinist or any of these things, you're coming to the text with that. And most people will, I think, would probably admit that, at least more of the level-headed ones, and that's on both sides. And then you're going to force the text to say, right, at least in your mind, and it might not even be a conscious thing. It might just be something you just intuitively do. And I want to So with that, I want to ask you, can you explain what sensus plenior is for everyone? Yeah. And then is it an appropriate way of explaining the New Testament use of the Old Testament?
Okay, so this goes back to, can a text mean what it never meant? A way to ask that question more particularly for this particular discussion of New Testament use of the Old Testament is, can the human author of Scripture mean something he never meant? That's the way they frame this question. We know that God is overall the divine author, but he used human agents. So the sensus plenior debate is, God as the divine author can intend something through the inspired text of an Old Testament author that he would not be aware of or aware of. Its sensus plenior means fuller sense. Okay, so the Old Testament author may not be aware of the fuller meaning of what he's actually writing, but God is, because God's the divine author. But the other side, and I'm very sympathetic to this, is saying that's neat, but you have this biblical author in the Old Testament writing what we should think is meaningful words to his original audience. And how is it possible that he can mean something by something he wrote and intended for this audience that he never meant that later audiences picked up on? And so that's another reason why they say no to sensus plenior and no to a text having two different meanings in two different contexts, even if it's referring to one thing. So that's the debate. Now, I am sympathetic to that, because I would hate to, if you've written things, I've written things, we type all the time. We're not inspired,
right?
But do you want to think that you ever wrote something that you meant to say something, but it means something you never meant? Whereas somebody else is controlling your meaning because you had an intended meaning in the words you wrote to an intended audience. Now, other people, say you're writing a response on Facebook about some theological, so other people might dig up that thread 5 years later and think you meant something, that you never meant. And then they start saying, well, Alex obviously believes this, and this because he wrote this in a context, right? That you and your original audience and the people you were chatting back and forth with, they understood all of the high context, as we call it, Herman. They understood the high context of that conversation. Some low context person comes in and thinks you mean, because they read your one thing because you commented on a verse or whatever within the scope of that conversation, and they think some other thing and say this is what he must have meant,
right? And
so the people who believe the unified meanings in both testaments are going to say, you're saying that a biblical author, we know that God can do whatever he wants, but that a biblical author had a meaning intended for his original audience, that number one, the original audience was left out of knowing what the words directed to them were to mean. And they wrote something that they probably never even possibly meant to write. Right?
So let me ask you.
They meant something that they never meant. And so that's the debate.
Let me ask you if this is a good example. I was just thinking as you were talking. So some unsaved folks will look at, I think Genesis 22, the Abraham and Isaac, situation about to, kill his own son,
right,
as some sort of, oh, God is so evil, this and that. And, I point out that, well, this is not a normative thing. God is very clear from beginning to end on what he feels about child sacrifice. And if you read it in context and understand it in context, Genesis 22 is a beautiful foreshadowing of the gospel. In fact, it's probably, to me, the most clear layout of the gospel in the Old Testament, especially in Genesis. And the other reason I say that is I don't think Moses had an idea that he was foreshadowing the gospel, right? As he recorded the events of what happened. So what would they say? Would they say, no, he knew that it was pointing forward to Christ?
That's more of an example of typology, right? And so typology is probably now the Bible has typology, like we talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Romans 5, you have type and antitype with Adam and Christ. You've got, David's a type of Christ.
Right.
Some people see Joshua as a type of Christ. Now that can go overboard. So take people who say that Song of Songs is really about God's love for the church or God's love. No, it's about what you think it's about.
Right.
So you can go a little too far.
And if you read it, that makes God a little weird, I think.
Right. It's bad enough that dudes like us are the bride of Christ, right? But then it just gets creepy if you start going overboard. But typology is generally shared between both sides, so they would see that as a type too. But you have passages like Isaiah 7:14. Mm-hmm. What did it mean? Well, if you take a certain position, you have to say that meant only Jesus, because you have one meaning in both texts, even though that just seems weird, right? Or not. And so, or some of the Psalms, right? Some of the Psalms that do have messianic implications, but really did have meaning to issues that David in his own life was facing and all that. So this is what we mean by like fuller meaning, fuller fulfillment. Fuller is better. I like fuller fulfillment of like prophetic text more so than I like double fulfillment, because I think double fulfillment can get tricky because there's not always a double fulfillment. Yeah. And where people think there is one. And so I like fuller fulfillment because there can be an initial thing, because that goes back into, well, God, what the New Testament authors were looking for is thematically everything's centered on Christ. Christ said as much about the Old Testament, right? And that's the way that they filtered everything through. So when that's where the idea of the broader context come in. They're looking at patterns in history. So Romans 9 is a perfect example of God's working throughout history, and you see a pattern that Paul's arguing is consistent with why not all Jews are being saved right now, because this is how God has dealt with it. So, in light of Christ being the stone, referencing Isaiah again, interestingly, the prophets are cited actually more than the Pentateuch, which throughout the New Testament, it's kind of an interesting little fact. Another interesting fact is, even though there's no direct citations of the Old Testament in the book of Revelation, it has the most echoes and allusions, over 150. So
interesting.
My light went off. This happens all the time. If you've ever seen me on anyone else's channel, this is normal.
It's the motion sensors.
Yeah, it doesn't see past my hutch here. I have a hutch, so you can't see past that.
So there was a comment by Word Women. It was actually something I was thinking right before she posted it, that one thing I often say is that God is, and this is the understatement of the year, right? That God is the ultimate multitasker. Yeah. That we kind of
actually that count real quick. Fact check myself. The actual number in Revelation is 605.
Oh wow, even more.
Yeah.
So God we kind of sometimes, and maybe unintendedly or unintentionally, we kind of place God on our level as far as his capacity to do what he does, even through people. And so isn't it possible that the God of the universe could embed two meanings in a text? Isn't that possible for an omnipotent, omniscient God to do? And I think everybody on either side would have to say yes, right?
Yes.
And so
they would, and the single reference would grant that, but just think that's not what's happening.
That seems kind of self-contradictory.
No, they're saying, well, I mean, God theoretically could do that if he wanted to, but they're going to argue that that's not what he wanted to do.
Okay, well,
but I like I said, I have reservations about sensus plenior, but I tend to go with it because it makes the most sense of of the phenomena of the New Testament that doesn't cooperate with what we find in the Old Testament on its own, which I appreciate the other view of saying they want to preserve that the text meant what it meant in the Old Testament. That's what it meant. That's what it means in the New Testament too, because they don't want to assume that the biblical authors are just making up stuff that God withheld from prior generations of the original audience of the Old Testament text. However, I don't think that carries text to text to text going through every Old Testament citation, let alone echoes and allusions, that's going to work. It just, because the flip side happens, and then you have the New Testament controlling what the Old Testament had to mean, and that runs you right back into saying that Isaiah in chapter 7, verse 14, said something that had no application to his original audience, which is their main complaint about the other side. It just doesn't work.
Can't have it both ways.
Yeah, but when you become more familiar with these Second Temple hermeneutic principles, they don't go overboard with them at all. I mean, a lot of times it's just straightforward meaning, but you do see various methods that they used at the time working its way out. You even see Paul change a word from it's in Ephesians chapter 4. I have it pulled up somewhere. Yeah, Ephesians 4:8, where it says he took many captives and gave gifts, right? If you go back to the Psalms, it says he received gifts. Now, you can say that's he's just kind of riffing on it. He's not really trying to, but I think he's trying to refer us back to the Psalms. Now, in the Targums, which is an Aramaic paraphrase kind of thing of in the first century of the Hebrew Bible, it says that the gave gifts. So maybe he referred to that version, which also changed from the original Hebrew. But however way you shake that out, he didn't have a problem with it, right?
Right.
In the original Hebrew, which I'm sure he knew, but probably working from a Targum he had available, or even if not, he knew that reading was out there somewhere and decided, I'm going to use that for my purpose. He didn't have a problem with it. I see no reason why I should have a problem with it. If it's okay for Paul, it's okay for me. I mean,
it becomes very revisionist at a certain point, right? And that's, I think, a kind of a danger on that side of it. And so, let me see. Well, let's ask this: Does the New Testament writers' use of Jewish exegetical methods explain the New Testament use of the Old Testament? If that makes sense,
it explains it better, right? So, like I said, it does. They don't go overboard, which you can get into. Later on, you see in early medieval exegetes of both Testaments, right? You have a spectrum between the Antiochian school and the Alexandrian school of interpreters, and then you get it further into the medieval period. They've got the 4 layers of meaning to a text: literal, allegorical, literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical. And so that's like the fullest meaning and stuff. And so they go 4 layers, and then you see, like I said, Augustine getting out there. You see Origen's methods, they just kind of go. And so I don't think they were going wild with it, but the phenomena is compelling enough to me that there are these different things that they're using. And sometimes you get tipped off that that's what they're doing, like Paul's using an allegorical way of reading an Old Testament text in Genesis. But sometimes you don't, but yet these hermeneutics that they were using in Paul's day seem to explain it better than trying to force meanings that, when you talk about text can't mean what it never meant, you're trying to force a meaning that the New Testament authors never meant by their use of the Old Testament. And the more that we've learned about the Second Temple hermeneutics, and the more you read and dig into Second Temple literature and seeing what people outside of the Christian community and prior to the arrival of Christ and all of the apocrypha and pseudepigraphical texts and stuff, once you get more familiar with this and you start reading about it, the more it helps you clarify. So you're trying to understand, what does Paul mean by using this verse? Okay.
Right.
You look around.
Let me ask you this while that's on my mind. So you look, especially, and I just want Paul's memory, to be honest with you. Every time I mean, this dude is in prison. I know sometimes he had the scrolls and stuff there, but a lot of times he's writing on the road. And anyway, he'll quote these long passages, but he also kind of cuts and pastes. It's Psalm 68, but also, even if you look at a good study Bible, and in one verse it's saying, go look at these 3 different verses, and that's how you see what Paul's quoting.
Yeah.
And so would people accuse Paul of taking things out of context to make his point? Or is there validity to the kind of cut and paste method to prove or to provide theological support for the statement he's making?
That's going to depend on what method he's using at the time, which is why it's really good to go brush up on the 7 rules of Hillel, or what a Pesher interpretation is, or the literalist approach, allegory, whatever, midrash, things like that. Because if the literalist approach doesn't work, if you go back and you find out, that's not working for this text. So, run through some of these other things, and it might make more sense. So I tend to think that Paul is either drawing thematically or taking into context the larger portions of that text, and not just what we call an atomistic approach, right? So an atomistic approach is, I'm going to take this sentence from the Old Testament, I'm going to insert it here, and I'm going to use it completely disconnected from its original meaning. I don't believe they ever do that. Right. I think that you can read the broader context and find either he's drawing on larger themes, or he's drawing on the context of the broader passage. So a good example of this would be in Romans chapter 9. Again, because it's so dense with New Testament citations, is why it's always a good example. So Jacob I loved, Esau I hated, right? Why is he bringing that in? Now that's from Malachi. So is he talking about individuals there, or is he being true to Malachi's context? Esau I hated, meaning the nations of Edom versus Israel. And how did he hate Edom? Well, he's going to destroy their mountains so they can never be rebuilt, right? It's not like malicious hatred or non-salvific hatred, because the remnant of Edom was subjugated by the Israelites anyway. Some people want to argue that no, that's not. He doesn't care about that. He's speaking of them as individual, which to me is never. And I don't want to upset the Calvinists, but. And not all Calvinists read Romans 9 the same way either. They get their Calvinism. They're actually are willing to go somewhere else for that. So other proof texts, they don't. So G.K. Bill's too clever for that kind of thing. But you will find that they're bringing in these larger thematic elements from the passages that they cite. And so when you get down to somewhere later in Romans 9, in verse 20 and 21, is talking about, will the thing formed say to the one who formed it, who made me like this, right? And he's talking about and that comes within the potter and the clay. Well, that's almost, that wording in the Greek is almost identical to the Septuagint reading of Isaiah. Was it 29:16 or 29:18? And so obviously he has that passage in mind, but just because those words are that in that sentence are reading fairly close to Isaiah 29, well, what about other places in Isaiah? There's 2 other places where the potter and clay analogy is being used. The most fullest treatment of the potter and clay analogy is from Jeremiah 18, and because he didn't explicitly introduce that will the thing form say the one as it is written, I mean, he does that earlier in Romans 9 when he's explicitly citing a text, but he's riffing off of all of these ideas. Well, you have to look at all of those contexts to see how does the theme of potter and clay in Isaiah 29, starting in verse 13, talking about you honor me with your lips and all that. The Jews that are just paying lip service, but their hearts are far from God and all that. How much of that do you bring in to help explain what Paul's on about in Romans 9 and answering a Jewish interlocutor, right? And some people, which I mentioned this earlier in the show, they will hold to Paul's use of the Old Testament. He's bringing in broader contexts and thematic elements and stuff. But I know certain Calvinists will get to that and be like, nope, we got to kick out all that Old Testament stuff because that gets in the way of our reading, right? And so I said, sometimes these things can trip you up. And then now all of a sudden they're arguing for a very atomistic point, or he's not even referring to it. Some people say, well, he's really more referring to the potter and clay that was used in the wisdom passage, which I reject that, because Paul certainly borrows from the wisdom of Solomon in Romans chapter 1, 18 and following. That's almost, a condensed version of Wisdom of Solomon, which is a book in the Apocrypha of chapters, I think 13 through 15, all condensed down in that back end of Romans chapter 1, verses 18 and following through 32. It's almost
a list of sins.
Reads the same. But the reason why I don't think that in chapter 9 he's referring to echoing the wisdom is that the potter in Wisdom of Solomon, and where the potter and clay gets brought up, the potter is an idol maker. And so that's why I'm like, well, the potter's God in Romans 9. So I don't think he really is referring to echoing that so much as he is. Which, if you look at the flow of Romans 9, for example, you go from the patriarchs to the Exodus to the exilic period, right? It's clear, in the way he's marshaling his Old Testament text. It's clear that he's referencing text closer to that, which would be Jeremiah and Isaiah. Now, when you said he'd start taking in Romans again, Romans is useful for all this. When you start he's taking a bit here and a bit there and a bit from everywhere. You've got the catena, just a string of Old Testament quotes, seemingly in chapter 3 to talk about how terrible all of humanity is, right? And starting verse 10 through verse 20. But what's interesting is go look at the wider context of every passage from the Psalms and Isaiah and elsewhere that he pulls together for all that one after another shotgun. We would call it shotgun proof text, right? But if you go look at and let's think of his proof texts there that he's using from the Old Testament. Let's think of those as the melody to a song. Okay, the melody is, there's none righteous, no, not one. Horrible, all that, right?
Sing it.
Yeah. But go read the wider context of every one of those.
Yeah.
You will see in that you will see this harmony in the wider context. And this harmony is that God is gearing up and ready to do something on behalf of his people, right? That God is about to bring the long arm of salvation in the wider context of Isaiah, and in the Psalm. God's about to do something. And so if you read the wider context of every one of those citations, all of a sudden he says in verse 21, but now the righteousness of God has been unveiled, and that opening up of Jesus Christ, and for everyone who believes, first of the Jew, first, how it goes, very majestic passage in Romans 3:21 through 28. But if you're hearing the echoes of the harmony of the wider context, you see that this melody is just downgrading humanity and uplifting God's ready to take action on behalf of salvific action on behalf of redeeming his people. So I think that people who are familiar with the Old Testament in the broader context, which they would be, his original audience, which granted is a mostly Gentile audience in Rome, but there's a sizable Jewish portion. But he expected all of them to be, like you said earlier, that was the Bible of their day, and they were taught the scriptures in the Old Testament. The Bereans, they were digging through the scriptures to make sure Paul wasn't off his rocker. So they had a good enough familiarity, and they would have heard not just that melody of how awful, not just the Gentiles in chapter 1 and the Jews in chapter 2, but everybody's horrible. Yeah. But they would hear that harmony from the wider context of the Old Testament passage, where it just explodes in verse 21. About the revealing of the apocalypse is the word used. The revelation of Jesus Christ. That God has presented him. So it's once you start doing that the text and that intertextuality and understanding what they're doing and how much of the broader context of the Old Testament text, you start to see it in 3D, I guess. And that's not, and what I'm not saying is that you're reading beneath the text. I'm not saying you're going behind the text in any sort of way.
Right.
I'm saying you're going to the fuller meaning of the Old Testament passages and bringing all those themes with you so that you see what Paul's doing, especially in a passage like Romans 3, where it's rapid fire. We would say he's shotgunning proof text like people accuse each other nowadays.
Yes.
Well, we do that because, we're trying to make some sort of argument or whatever, and you don't have time to go fact check all their exegesis. Are they using those texts properly?
And I think one other thing is interesting.
But he's not doing that. Paul's not doing that. Paul's thematically arranging a bunch of things, both for the melody, its main thing, but the wider context of God's on the move. So,
right. And I think what's interesting too, that we have to remember that people have to remember in a broader context is, and part of the thing, and I did a bit, taught this course, Bibliology, or online course I created, but if you study scripture, that we didn't have chapters and verses initially, not till 1200 with and then 1500 with verses. And so the reality is, even when Paul's quoting stuff, he's not quoting Psalm 68 verse whatever.
Right.
He's quoting. So he has to know the fuller meaning, or the fuller context rather, in order to pull that out in the first place. Right. But what we're able to do when I want to support my personal theological position, I can Google, okay, what are all the verses on XYZ, and I'll just blast those out at my contenders. Well, they didn't have that, obviously. Obviously, they didn't have Google or internet, but they also didn't have chapters and verses. They had the Pentateuch. They had scrolls of information and writings. So even to do what some might accuse Paul of doing, or misrepresent him of doing, he couldn't do. No, I mean, not just him. None of them could do that. And actually, I want to be fair to all sides, and I want to ask this question, because then the flip side is, from a hermeneutic perspective, what are some of the potential dangers in looking for a deeper meaning all the time? Not saying you're doing this or I'm doing this, but we know people who do this.
Oh, sure.
There's so many Christians and even pastors that have made certain passages analogical when they clearly are historical or written that way, at least miracle accounts or even the resurrection. But that's largely an outward expression of their own discomfort with spiritual or supernatural things or events. And I'm not talking about just atheists who do this. Christian, well, I guess if you want to use that term, they're claiming the name of Christ, yet demoting the supernatural, but that's out of their own discomfort. It's not out of how the text is actually written. So then so can you speak to the danger of always looking for meaning behind the meaning, sort of thing?
Yeah, I'm not a fan. I find it very interesting. And while I agree with some of the insights from like medieval theologians, for example, I'm not a fan of that 4 layers of meaning.
Yeah.
Like that's right. Now, and I might agree with some of their theological insights. I'm like, that's very good. That's very true. That's not from that verse. I'm like, I agree that that's a very, I can relate to what you're saying, but that has nothing to do with the text you're talking about. Sorry, you get that.
Yeah,
that's not get that out of here. So that kind of thing, I'm not a fan of. But the question the way to think about this is, can we do what the New Testament authors did? Now, if you're the single meaning in both Testaments person, you're going to answer that question with a yes. Of course you can, because it only means one thing, and the New Testament text, it can only mean what it meant, and that's it. So of course you can do what the New Testament authors were doing with their Old Testament, with both Testaments, because you have to get the meaning right, and it only means that, right? So they're going to say yes. I have to say, on the other side, I have to say a qualified no. No, we can't, because when we think about grammatical historical hermeneutics, we're trying to understand the intended author's meaning as it would be understood by the intended original audience.
Right.
Now, part of the historical part of the grammatical historical hermeneutics is doing the hard work of history, which means you go look up what were Second Temple Jews doing with their Bibles, right? And which Paul was a Second Temple Jew, Peter was a Second Temple Jew, Jesus was a Second Temple Jew. They lived in that. What were they doing? Okay, so once we do the historical work, we can find out what they meant by their use of the Old Testament.
Right.
But that's just doing plain old grammatical historical hermeneutics. And if you want to do the best form of that, you'll do socio-rhetorical hermeneutics, which is the best expression of grammatical historical hermeneutics, because that takes you through all the textures. You start doing a thicker readings of the Bible, especially with this intertextuality business.
Your student is teaching us this in the chat.
Yeah.
MJ.
MJ, he knows. But that's just us doing good hermeneutics to find out what they were doing so that we can understand what the Old Testament author meant in his context, what the New Testament author meant in his context, and how that all shakes out. But there's a part of me that says, okay, Paul says, imitate me like I imitate Christ. And so Paul also used allegory, but here's where my qualified note. Yes, we're all familiar with biblical passages. So if you want to use something like a parable or a story from the Bible to help illustrate something, as long as you do what Paul does and give a big, clear warning in advance, this is what I'm doing. This is not what that text means, but this kind of scenario may help you understand this life application or something.
Right.
I'm not against that, as long as you tell people that you're not claiming this is what it meant. As long as you do that, I'm fine with it. But as far as trying to find hidden meanings that nobody's ever thought of, that's how heresy's born. You know, trying to get creative with text and let them mean whatever you need them to mean. No, because we want to know what they meant.
Exactly.
And what they meant might be harder to uncover unless we know what they were doing with their text when it comes to intertextuality in the Old Testament. But we can't just get creative because we are not Second Temple Jews that are inspired in that time, in that place with, you know, those ends that they were trying to reach with their arguments and the way that they were using the Old Testament text.
Yeah.
They had those tools. We have one tool, the grammatical historical hermeneutic, or this, you know, and however you want to do that. And that's so that we can understand what they meant, whether it's a New Testament author citing an Old Testament author, a New Testament author citing a Second Temple pseudo-graphical text, citing a pagan poet, whatever they're doing. We want to use our hermeneutics to find out what they meant to their audience. Yeah. And that's the only way we can figure out what it means.
Right.
So no, unless you give a big, like I said, a big disclaimer saying, I'm just using this as an analogy because it's a familiar story, but I'm not saying this is what it means, but here's, as long as you do that, I'm fine. But
I'm
otherwise,
I remember there's a couple of times, you know, I'll be teaching and I'm like, look, this is Alex talking right now. And I'll kind of like make that disclaimer just to avoid what you just said. So this is our last question. How do you see, or how have you seen kind of anachronism present in, well, either present in present day or even in first, second, third century, you know, external writings, even if you look at maybe the patristics or other writings by other Jewish groups at that time, but play a role in leading to kind of a flawed exegesis. So like I talk a lot about we have to understand Eastern culture to really understand the Bible, because it was in Eastern culture. It was written from Easterners to Easterners in that context. So if you don't understand ancient Near East cultures, you're very likely going to take some stuff out of context, right?
Yes.
So as far as anachronism and reading our stuff or our ideas or things back into that day, do you think this is like a relatively recent phenomenon of the last 200 to 300 years, or I guess maybe to the back to the Middle Ages, as you said, or have you seen this all the way from the start of the New Testament? Well,
when you're talking about reading ideas back in you start to see that basically anachronistic. I wouldn't say you get much anachronisms in the patristics so much as when you get to the medieval period. Not that the patristics were right about how they understood all the text by any means. No. But But the further you get from, I'd say, the 4th century on, thought category, change happens slower in the ancient world than the modern world, but thought categories and things like that and ideas that further developed get read back into the text. But it's easier to spot that, with modern examples. Okay. So a common idea would be, and to tie, this happens in general, but to tie it to the New Testament use of the Old Testament. A common example would be for modern Western people, but the ancient that are individualist cultures, that are guilt-oriented cultures as opposed to honor-shame cultures.
Right.
Okay, so they will read certain texts, and they will say, "Oh, look at how introspective and emotional Jesus got over Lazarus dying." So the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept.
Jesus wept.
Right? People think that's got to be so easy to understand. It's just the simplest thing. He started crying. Right? Then you say, well, what do you understand about 1st century Jewish lament practices? What do you understand about demonstrations of honor, for the recently deceased and public displays of lament and honor, honor giving and stuff?
That's good.
Because you read that text, oh, well, Jesus started crying because his friend died. That's true. He did cry with tears. Was he overcome with emotion? Probably not. Probably not. What was he overcome with? A public display of honor and lament. That's why they had even lamenters who paid professional mourners. Right. You knew exactly what I was going to say. So what do you know? And they were there too. So what do you know about all of that? But once you learn about all that stuff, it becomes, just, like I said, it's that 3D thing. But we can read, Jesus became so overly emotional into that. When he knew he was about to rape. That's not really what's going on. He was demonstrating how much of an honor he held this person in. And of course, he raised him up. So you see anachronisms like that, simple things. You see individualistic readings and people's, it goes back to the New Testament use of the Old Testament, like I said, with Jacob I loved and Esau I hated. Well, that's got to be about the babies, right? And even if it's from Malachi and not Genesis, it's still about the babies because it helps my theological perspective. Whoa. Number one, it's, you got to understand typology. You've got to understand, collectivism, right? The individual secondary. The individual gets his identity insofar as he identifies with a corporate head and a corporate body, right? His whole self-understanding is other-oriented, right? He doesn't, if he sat and contemplated, what do I want to be with my own life, he would have, that's totally foreign, because what you want to be is what is viewed as most valuable to the group. Right. And how others esteem you is how you get your own self-understanding. It's not, you can't just walk around and give yourself your own honor. You can try, but
we don't get that over here.
Right. Yeah. So people read a lot of bad ideas of individualism and guilt ideas, and they anachronistically read text, and they totally miss what the text is really trying to say. Right. And especially with Old Testament texts, that Paul in Romans 9 again is using Pharaoh he is applying the most wicked villain in Israel's history as a type for disbelieving Israel in Paul's day, right? So just because Pharaoh is an individual he's representing he's saying this is your identity to the interlocutor, right? Yeah. So, but people will misread all of these kind of things because they anachronistically read modern Western-oriented individualistic ideas back into the text. So that you see a lot of anachronisms like that, and I forgive it for people who haven't studied this.
Correct.
I don't forgive it for scholars who should know better but are either too lazy to read contemporary scholarship or don't want to agree with it because it's going to upset their tradition card.
I concur completely. Man, this has been a really great discussion. Maybe we'll bring you back to talk about some other nuances in this realm. But I definitely appreciate you jumping on tonight to give us your insight, your wisdom. And I appreciate everybody in the chat and the questions and comments, and your students are in here, teaching lessons as well. So this is great. Thank you. And once again, there he is. So Troy. Thank you, John. And until next time, we'll leave it right here.
All right. Oh, wait, you got to tell them where you're going.
Oh, jump on over to BK's channel.
I'll be listening on the way home.
All right. Yeah, we'll be chopping up some other things over there on Kevin Wesley. So yeah, until next time, you all have a good one.